Pay attention to this security camera footage from November 8, 2023, captured in Cedar Falls, North Carolina. A doorbell camera mounted on the front of a brick colonial recorded exactly 27 seconds that afternoon. An 84-year-old man sits in a wheelchair on the front porch, thin and frail, wrapped in a blue blanket despite the mild weather. A 38-year-old black woman wearing purple scrubs steps through the front door behind him and walks around to face him directly. She kneels down, takes both of his hands in hers, and presses them against her chest while he says something that makes her laugh. What happens next is tender and unmistakable as she leans forward and kisses his forehead before standing up, moving behind the wheelchair and pushing him back toward the door. At 4:47 p.m., they disappear inside the house, and this is the last time Denise Holloway is seen alive. 9 days pass before anyone finds her. November 17, 2023, at 5:12 in the morning, a jogger on Route 9 outside Cedar Falls notices something in a drainage ditch that doesn't belong there and calls 911. Deputies arrive at 5:38 a.m. to discover Denise Holloway with her hands bound by zip ties, duct tape residue around her mouth, and ligature marks on her neck consistent with strangulation. The purple scrubs she wore 9 days earlier still cling to her body, and investigators determined she'd been dead for over a week while her picture hung on missing person flyers across 3 counties. Most people hear about this case and assume random crime. Wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong person nearby. That assumption is wrong. This story centers on $1.7 million revised will and a brother who spent 60 years believing the world owed him something and finally decided to collect. The timeline starts on August 4, 2020, when Harold Menton, 81 years old, tumbles down the stairs of the home he'd lived in for 47 years. His hip shatters on impact, and while the surgery goes well, complications pile up fast with infection, a second surgery, and partial paralysis on his left side. Doctors deliver the verdict that he'll never walk unassisted again. 2 living relatives remain in Harold's life at this point. His brother, Richard Menton, 76 years old, lives 40 minutes away in Granton as a retired contractor carrying the baggage of 3 divorces and a 2018 lawsuit for unpaid debts, a man perpetually short on money and convinced the world cheated him. Richard's son, Craig Menton, 47 years old, works odd jobs through his father's old construction contacts and carries a record that includes assault charges in 2009 and 2019, both dropped, plus a DUI in 2014. The first month after Harold's fall brings Richard to visit twice with flowers in hand and the right words on his lips, though his questions drift toward the house, the savings, and whether Harold has updated his will. Harold notices this but keeps quiet. Month 2 brings a single visit with Craig tagging along, and Craig moves through the house slowly, his eyes lingering on furniture, paintings, and silverware in a way that Harold also notices. Month 3 brings nothing at all, no visits and no calls. By December 2020, 6 weeks have passed without a word from his brother, and Harold spends Christmas alone eating a frozen dinner in front of the television, while wondering if this is how his story ends. His physical therapist recommends a home health aide for daily tasks, medication management, and mobility assistance. Harold resists because he's lived alone since his wife Eleanor died in 2011 and doesn't want strangers in his space. His body refuses to cooperate with his wishes, and simple tasks become hour-long ordeals that leave him exhausted. January 11, 2021 marks the day Harold finally calls Comfort First Home Care, and that's when they send Denise Holloway. Denise Holloway entered the world in Raleigh 35 years earlier, raised by a single mother working 2 jobs while Denise started earning money at 14 to help with bills and help raise her younger brother. Nursing school accepted her at 22, and her future seemed clear until her mother suffered a stroke that changed everything. 3 years of round-the-clock caregiving followed until her mother passed in 2016, and by then, nursing school had become financially impossible and emotionally unthinkable. Certification as a home health aide came next, and Denise discovered she excelled at the work and loved it deeply. 5 years of experience, a 4.8-star rating, 31 families served, and not a single complaint decorated her record by the time she arrived at Harold's house on January 11, 2021. What she found that first day painted a grim picture. Harold sat in the living room with 2 weeks of stubble on his face, dishes piled in the sink, and unopened mail scattered across the table. His eyes met hers and offered nothing. No greeting, no acknowledgement. Denise chose not to push and simply introduced herself before asking if she could make him some lunch. Harold shrugged and told her to do what she wanted, so she made a grilled cheese sandwich with tomato soup from a can, nothing fancy, and set it in front of him before sitting across the table. Harold stared at the food, then at her, and asked if she planned to hover over him. Her response was direct. He wasn't a child and didn't need hovering. Something close to a smile crossed his face for the first time in weeks, and he ate his first real meal in days. That night after Denise left, Harold opened his journal and wrote an entry investigators would discover 3 years later. The words read, "New caregiver started today. Denise, doesn't treat me like I'm dying. Might actually like this one." The next year transformed Denise from an employee into something essential in Harold's life. She learned he'd spent 34 years as an English professor at Cedar Falls Community College, teaching Shakespeare, Hemingway, and Faulkner, and that boxes of student papers he'd never thrown away still filled his closets. Her questions about his favorite book sparked conversations lasting 3 hours or more. She discovered his wife Eleanor had died of cancer in 2011 after 52 years of marriage, that they'd never had children, and that Harold had never truly recovered from losing her. A photo album turned up in a closet one afternoon, and Denise brought it to him so they could spend the entire day looking at pictures of Eleanor together. Tears streamed down Harold's face for the first time since the funeral, and Denise offered no words, just her presence beside him and her hand holding his. His love of classical music, Mozart especially, led her to download playlists on her phone for his physical therapy sessions. His memories of cooking elaborate Sunday meals for Eleanor inspired her to reorganize the kitchen so he could help from his wheelchair, and together they made beef stew, chicken pot pie, and bread pudding, while he smiled in a way he hadn't smiled in years. Harold started looking forward to her visits, started shaving again, started opening his mail again. By March 2022, something fundamental had shifted between them. Denise caught herself noticing how Harold watched her as she moved around the kitchen and how his entire face transformed when she walked through the door. What troubled her more was realizing she'd started staying longer than her duties required, inventing excuses to extend her visits, and thinking about him during hours when she wasn't there. Professional boundaries exist for good reasons, and she understood this completely. Harold had stopped being just a patient somewhere along the way and had become her friend, her confidant, the person she shared her own struggles and loneliness with. April 14th, 2022 arrived as a difficult day for Harold, with pain flaring and frustration mounting until he snapped at Denise over something as trivial as the way she folded a towel. She showed no reaction, just finished folding and sat down across from him. Tears filled Harold's eyes as he apologized and asked why she bothered staying with a bitter old man waiting to die. Denise reached across and wrapped her hand around his, telling him he wasn't bitter, just lonely, and that those two things were different. She told him she stayed because she wanted to, not because anyone required her to. Neither of them let go for a long time. That night, Harold's journal entry read, "I think I'm falling in love with her. I'm 83 years old. This is absurd. But when she held my hand today, I felt something I haven't felt since Eleanor. I don't know what to do with this." Months passed without either of them addressing what was growing between them, at least not directly. The intimacy deepened through longer conversations and more personal revelations. She described her mother's stroke, the years spent as caregiver, and the guilt that still followed her. He shared Eleanor's final months, the words he wished he'd spoken, and the loneliness that had consumed him since. Holding hands became more frequent, sometimes lasting minutes at a time with neither of them speaking. July 2022 brought Harold's 83rd birthday, and Denise arrived carrying a chocolate cake she'd baked herself because she knew it was his favorite. Streamers decorated the dining room in a display that seemed ridiculous for an 83-year-old man, and he loved every bit of it. Cake and Mozart and hours of conversation filled the evening. When Denise stood to leave, Harold caught her hand and told her he needed to say something. He knew his age made this senseless, but she had become the best thing in his life for the past 12 years, and even though he expected nothing, he needed her to know how he felt. Denise knelt beside his wheelchair and looked directly into his eyes. Her response was simple. She knew, because she felt the same way. The kiss she placed on his forehead sealed what had been building between them. From that night forward, they existed as a couple behind closed doors. Public announcements never came, and they never told anyone, understanding exactly how it would appear to outsiders. An 83-year-old man and his 36-year-old caregiver drawing obvious conclusions. Inside Harold's house, behind walls that kept the world at bay, they built something genuine. Denise continued providing care and helping with medications, mobility, and daily routines. But now she stayed for dinners and sometimes spent nights in the guest room, close enough to respond if Harold needed her. Their conversations ranged across books, music, philosophy, and death itself. Harold confided that dying didn't frighten him, but dying alone did. Denise made a promise that he wouldn't. September 2023 shattered their peace when Richard Menton reappeared. No warning preceded his arrival at Harold's house, his first visit in over a year. Denise answered the door, and Richard pushed past her without offering his name or any greeting. Finding Harold in the living room, Richard announced they needed to discuss family business. Harold looked at this brother who hadn't called in 14 months and asked what he wanted. Richard glanced at Denise and demanded they speak alone. Harold refused, stating that anything Richard needed to say could be said in front of Denise. Richard's face hardened as he explained that business had declined and he needed $50,000 to survive the quarter. Harold let silence hang in the air before delivering a single word. No. Anger flashed across Richard's features as he reminded Harold that he was his brother, his only family. Harold's voice stayed steady as he pointed out that Richard hadn't visited in a year, hadn't called on his birthday, and now appeared only because money had run out. The answer remained no. Richard's attention shifted to Denise, and accusation filled his voice as he blamed her for turning Harold against his own family. Cold fury entered Harold's response as he ordered Richard out of his house. Richard left, slamming the door hard enough to knock a picture off the wall. That evening, Harold contacted his attorney Patricia Simmons with a request to update his will. October 3, 2023, saw Harold sign a new will that restructured everything. The previous version from 2015 had allocated $800,000 to Richard, $400,000 to Craig, and $500,000 to various charities. The new document slashed Richard's share to $100,000, reduced Craig's to $50,000, and directed $1.7 million plus the house plus all remaining assets to Denise Holloway. One clause stood out among the legal language. If any beneficiary received a conviction for any crime against Denise Holloway, their inheritance would vanish entirely and transfer to charity. The document was legally airtight, signed, and done. What Harold couldn't know was that Patricia Simmons employed a paralegal named Beth Crane, whose husband played poker every Thursday night with Craig Menton. 4 days after the signing, on October 7th, Beth mentioned the gossip to her husband, marveling that some old man had left nearly $2 million to his nurse. The following Thursday at poker night, her husband shared this information. Craig went silent and left the game early. October 9th brought a phone call from Craig to his father with 3 words: "Dad, we have a problem." The next day, October 10th, 2023, Richard and Craig met at Richard's house for a conversation that would later seal their fate. Investigators eventually recovered fragments from Craig's phone, where 6 minutes of audio had been accidentally recorded while the device sat in his pocket. Richard's voice carried anger as he declared that she'd been working on Harold for 3 years, and that money belonged to them. Craig's response asked about contesting the will, but Richard dismissed that option after consulting a lawyer who confirmed Harold's mental competency and the document's solidity. Craig pressed for alternatives, and Richard's voice dropped as he explained that if something happened to Alicia before Harold died, the bequest would become invalid, and the money would revert to them. Silence stretched before Craig asked if his father was serious. Richard's response dripped with conviction. He refused to lose $2 million to some caregiver who had manipulated his brother because that money was supposed to be his, their grandfather had promised him. Craig asked about logistics, and Richard reminded him that construction work had introduced him to people who handled problems for money. A name surfaced in Craig's mind: Marcus, a man who'd done repo work, collections, and intimidation, someone who might do more for the right price. Richard told him to find out. October 14th brought Craig to a bar in Granton for a meeting with Marcus Webb. Marcus carried 42 years of hard living, a history as a repo man, multiple assault charges that never stuck, and a reputation in certain circles as a man who made problems disappear. Craig laid out the situation: a caregiver, an old man, an inheritance. Marcus listened while nursing his beer, then asked the price. Craig offered $40,000, half up front and half after completion. Marcus agreed, but explained he'd need a second person for logistics. Craig confirmed the total would stay at $40,000 regardless of how Marcus split it. Marcus nodded and told Craig to send everything: her name, her schedule, her car, her address. He'd handle the rest. The 3 weeks between October 15th and November 7th became a period of methodical preparation. Marcus recruited Daryl Sims, a 38-year-old carrying 2 armed robbery convictions who'd been paroled in 2021 and desperately needed money. Together, they gathered intelligence on their target. Denise's schedule ran Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., sometimes later. Her car was a silver Toyota Camry with plate Victor Delta 7741. Her apartment sat at 1488 Oakwood Drive, Unit 12 in Cedar Falls. Her grocery runs happened every Wednesday after work at the same store, parking in the same area in the back corner of the lot. They watched and waited and refined their plan. Phone records would later reveal 14 calls between Richard and Craig during this period, averaging 8 minutes each. November 3rd brought a text from Richard asking if this was happening or not. Craig's response confirmed next week that they were ready. Richard's final message consisted of 2 words: make it clean. November 8th, 2023 arrived as a Wednesday, and Denise reached Harold's house at 8:15 a.m. for what seemed like a normal day of breakfast, medications, and physical therapy. 2 streets away, Marcus and Daryl sat in their vehicle and waited. Around 2 p.m., Harold's behavior turned nervous, fidgeting in his chair and checking his watch repeatedly. Denise noticed and asked if everything was okay. Harold smiled and told her everything was fine, that he wanted to show her something before she left. Curiosity sparked, but she didn't push, and the afternoon unfolded with Mozart playing through speakers and conversation, drifting to a Hemingway novel Harold wanted her to read. Around 4:30 p.m., Harold asked Denise to take him onto the front porch to enjoy what he called a beautiful day, unusually warm for November. The doorbell camera activated with the motion. 4:46 p.m. Watch what happens next. Denise pushes Harold's wheelchair onto the porch and moves around to face him before kneeling down. Harold's hand trembles as he reaches into his pocket and withdraws a small box. Denise freezes as he opens it to reveal a simple, elegant ring with a single diamond. Harold's words carry the weight of 3 years. He knows he can't get down on one knee, knows this defies convention, but Denise Holloway gave him 3 years of happiness when he believed he'd never feel anything again. Whatever time remains to him, he wants to spend with her. He asks if she'll marry him. Tears stream down Denise's face as she takes both his hands and presses them against her chest and says yes, then says yes again, then says yes a 3rd time through laughter mixed with crying. She leans forward and kisses his forehead before standing, moving behind the wheelchair, and pushing him back toward the door. 4:47 p.m. They disappear inside. 27 seconds of footage that the prosecution would play 11 months later so a jury could watch Denise accept a proposal from a man she loved. They would understand this wasn't manipulation or scheming. This was real. But in that moment, Denise had no way of knowing she had less than an hour to live. Inside the house, celebration took over. Harold produced a bottle of wine he'd been saving for a special occasion, and they toasted and talked about the future, where they'd hold the wedding and who they'd invite. Denise mentioned wanting to tell her brother, expecting shock but betting on happiness once he understood. Harold announced he didn't care what anyone else thought because he'd waited 84 years to feel this way again. Around 5:30 p.m., Denise began gathering her things, explaining she needed groceries and promising to return first thing tomorrow. Harold caught her hand and asked her to stay, suggesting they order dinner instead. Denise smiled and reminded him they had the rest of their lives. She kissed him goodbye and walked out the front door at 5:38 p.m., got into her silver Camry, and drove toward the grocery store. Marcus and Daryl followed. At 5:47 p.m., Denise pulled into the grocery store parking lot and chose her usual spot in the back corner, away from the main entrance where things stayed quieter. She stepped out, locked her car, and started walking toward the store. A gray van pulled up beside her, and the side door slid open. Daryl grabbed her from behind with his hand clamping over her mouth as she fought and screamed, but his 6'1" frame and 210 pounds overpowered her 5'7" and 130. Marcus pulled her into the van while Daryl applied zip ties to her wrists and duct tape over her mouth. 41 seconds from start to finish. A woman loading groceries 3 rows away heard something, looked up, and saw a gray van pulling away fast. She thought it seemed strange but didn't call anyone. The van drove east out of Cedar Falls, past the county line, and delivered Denise to an abandoned farmhouse 22 miles outside town, a property foreclosed in 2019 with no neighbors for half a mile. They carried her inside. Daryl asked Marcus what happened next. Marcus pulled out his phone and called Craig. "We have her," Craig's voice came through, asking them to hold her there while he called back. Craig dialed his father next, reported that they had her, and asked what they should do. Richard allowed silence to stretch before delivering his answer. "Finish it. Leave no witnesses. Leave no evidence." Craig called Marcus back with 2 words. "Do it. Clean." 6:23 p.m. marked the moment 45 minutes after the abduction when Marcus wrapped a length of rope around Denise's neck and began strangling her. She struggled and tried to fight but couldn't break free. 4 minutes passed, and then she stopped moving. They left her body in the farmhouse and drove the van to a lot behind an abandoned factory, wiped it down, and walked away. 6:48 p.m. brought Craig to a diner off Route 9, where he handed over a backpack containing $20,000 in cash, the second half of the payment. Marcus counted the bills and asked if they were good. Craig nodded and confirmed they were. Each man went his separate way. Craig drove home where his wife asked about his day. "Long day," he told her, "nothing special." He ate dinner, watched television, and went to bed. His father's caregiver lay dead in an abandoned farmhouse, and Craig slept without trouble. Meanwhile, back at the grocery store at 6:02 p.m., a store employee on break noticed Denise's car sitting in the lot with the door hanging open and a purse lying on the ground. She called her manager, who called police, and officers arrived at 6:24 p.m. They found the purse with phone and wallet inside, keys scattered on the pavement, and clear signs of an abduction. The plates traced back to Denise Holloway, home health aide employed by Comfort First Home Care. They contacted her emergency listing, her brother Marcus Holloway, no relation to Marcus Webb, who confirmed he hadn't heard from her. A call to her employer revealed she'd been working with Harold Menton. A detective arrived at Harold's house at 8:15 p.m. and found Harold in the living room, worried because Denise should have called by now. The detective explained that Denise's car had been found with signs of abduction. Color drained from Harold's face as denial poured out of him. She'd just left. She was just here. He told the detective everything about the relationship, the proposal that afternoon, and the ring she'd accepted. He described Richard's confrontation in September, the demand for money, and the threats that followed. The detective took detailed notes. November 9th brought Richard and Craig into the station for questioning. Richard claimed he hadn't seen his brother in 2 months. Craig stated he'd been home all day and offered his wife his confirmation. Craig's wife backed his story, placing him home from 4 p.m. onward. Richard's girlfriend confirmed he'd been with her starting at 3 p.m. The alibis appeared solid, but detectives observed something about Craig. Nervous energy, sweat on his brow, eyes that refused to meet theirs. Without enough evidence to hold either man, they released them both. Days became a week. Search teams covered the area surrounding the grocery store and found nothing. Divers checked nearby lakes and found nothing. Volunteers canvassed neighborhoods and found nothing. Denise had vanished. Harold stopped eating and stopped speaking, just sat in his wheelchair staring at the ring box. November 17th at 5:12 a.m., a jogger on Route 9 spotted a shape in a drainage ditch that didn't belong and called 911. Deputies arrived at 5:38 a.m. and found Denise Holloway. Her body had been moved from the farmhouse and dumped here within the previous 48 hours. Zip ties still bound her hands, ligature marks circled her neck, and the purple scrubs remained on her body. The medical examiner estimated death on November 8th, within hours of her abduction. She had been dead for 9 days. The investigation shifted into high gear. Forensic examination of the body revealed synthetic fibers under her fingernails consistent with vehicle carpet. DNA analysis of the zip ties identified 2 contributors, neither in existing databases. Canvassing Route 9 produced a farmer who remembered seeing a gray van parked near the ditch around 2 a.m. on November 15th, which struck him as strange at the time. The search for the van ended 3 days later, when investigators found it abandoned behind a factory. Someone had wiped it down, but not thoroughly enough. Hair samples recovered from the back matched one of the DNA contributors from the zip ties. Cross-referencing against known associates of Craig Menton produced a match: Daryl Sims. November 28th brought the arrest of Daryl Sims, who immediately requested a lawyer. His attorney understood the evidence pointed toward conviction. DNA on the murder victim combined with hair in the van left little room for defense. Prosecutors offered a deal: full cooperation and testimony against everyone else in exchange for life with possibility of parole after 25 years instead of the death penalty. Daryl accepted. His confession covered everything. Craig had approached Marcus had recruited him, and the total payment was $40,000, of which he'd received $15,000. He described the abduction in detail, the farmhouse, and watching Marcus strangle Denise. He provided Craig's phone number and Marcus's address and identified the diner where payment had been exchanged. And he revealed that Craig had mentioned his father wanted this done. His father, Richard Menton. December 4th brought a wave of arrests. Craig Menton faced charges of first-degree murder, conspiracy, kidnapping, and solicitation. Richard Menton faced charges of first-degree murder, conspiracy, and solicitation. Marcus Webb faced charges of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and murder for hire. All 3 entered not guilty pleas. May 14, 2024, opened the trial. Prosecutors laid out phone records showing 14 calls between Richard and Craig during October. Text messages documented the planning, including Richard's November 3rd inquiry about whether this was happening, Craig's confirmation that they were ready, and Richard's instruction to make it clean. Bank records showed Craig withdrawing $20,000 cash on October 16th and another $20,000 on November 7th. The audio fragment from Craig's pocket played for the jury, capturing Richard's voice, declaring that if she died before Harold, the bequest would become invalid and the money would return to them. Forensic evidence connected Daryl's DNA to the zip ties, his hair to the van, and fibers from the van to Denise's body. Then, the prosecution played the doorbell footage. 27 seconds filled the courtroom, Denise kneeling before Harold, taking his hands, pressing them against her chest, crying as he proposed, kissing his forehead, pushing him inside. 4:47 p.m., 51 minutes before she disappeared. The jury watched a woman accept a marriage proposal from a man she loved, then heard how someone strangled her to death less than an hour later because her name appeared in a will. Day 9 of the trial brought Craig's defense attorney forward with an offer. Craig would testify against his father in exchange for life with parole after 30 years. Prosecutors accepted. Craig took the stand and testified that his father had proposed the plan. Richard had declared the money was supposed to be his because their grandfather had promised him, and he refused to let a caregiver steal what belonged to the family. Craig testified that Richard told him to find someone capable of handling the problem. Craig testified about contacting Marcus and paying $40,000. Craig testified about calling Marcus after the abduction and asking what happened. Marcus had answered that it was done and she was gone. Craig testified about reporting this to his father. Richard's response had been a single word: good. The jury deliberated for 5 hours before returning with verdicts. Guilty on all counts for all defendants. July 2, 2024 brought sentencing. Richard Menton received life without parole. Craig Menton received life with parole after 30 years. Marcus Webb received life without parole. Daryl Sims received life with parole after 25 years. Court adjourned, but the destruction wasn't finished. August 19, 2024 brought the death of Harold Menton. Heart failure appeared on the official documentation as natural causes. The hospice nurse who attended him in his final weeks described a man who had stopped talking, stopped responding, stopped doing anything except sitting in his wheelchair and holding the ring box while staring at nothing. The night he died, his eyes opened. One sentence escaped his lips. "I held her hand for 3 years. They couldn't let me have 3 more months." And then his heart stopped. The will delivered its final twist. Because Denise died before Harold, her bequest became void. But because Richard and Craig received convictions for crimes against her, the clause Harold had insisted upon activated. Their inheritance vanished, all of it, every dollar. The entire $185 million estate transferred to charity, specifically the Cedar Falls Community College Scholarship Fund named after Eleanor Menton, Harold's late wife. Richard and Craig murdered Denise for $1.7 million. They received nothing. One moment from the trial should stay with you. During Marcus Webb's sentencing, the judge asked if he had anything to say. Marcus surveyed the courtroom and let his gaze settle on Harold's empty wheelchair, which prosecutors had brought as an exhibit. His words came out flat. He'd done a lot of things for money, but this one was the easiest because she didn't even fight at the end, just cried and asked why. He paused before adding that he didn't have an answer for her. Then he sat down. Consider what this case reveals. Denise Holloway operated by the book. Professional boundaries held for 2 years before feelings developed naturally. No manipulation occurred, no pressure applied, just genuine care for a lonely old man abandoned by his own family. Harold's decision didn't stem from incompetence. 3 doctors evaluated him and confirmed complete lucidity. Love and gratitude drove that decision, recognition that Denise had given him 3 years of dignity, 3 years of companionship, 3 years of feeling human again. Richard and Craig saw that money as theirs by blood. Richard's year-long absence didn't matter. Craig's complete lack of visits didn't matter. The money was supposed to be theirs, and when they discovered otherwise, they eliminated what stood in their way. Return to November 8th at 4:46 p.m. Denise kneels in front of Harold on that porch with no knowledge that Marcus and Daryl wait 2 streets away or that Craig has already transmitted her license plate. 52 minutes of freedom remain to her. She's simply accepting a proposal from a man she loves. 27 seconds later, she's inside. 51 minutes after that, she's gone. 4 minutes beyond that, she's dead. 9 days pass before anyone finds her. 8 months bring convictions for her killers. 10 months claim Harold's life. A family decided inheritance outweighed human life, and this is what followed. Anyone working in home healthcare needs to understand what happened here. Denise carried perfect reviews, 5 years of experience, 31 families served, and 0 complaints. She still became a target because compassion made her one. The warning signs didn't come from her behavior. They came from the family's reaction. Richard appearing after a year of silence to demand money should have registered as a warning sign. Richard blaming Denise when Harold refused should have registered as a warning sign. Richard storming out with threats should have registered as a warning sign. Denise should have documented these incidents, reported them, and created a paper trail. She believed the situation would resolve itself. Murder was how it resolved. The Menton case closed in July 2024. Richard, Craig, Marcus, and Daryl occupy prison cells. Harold occupies a grave. Denise occupies a grave. But questions persist. How many other families look at a caregiver and see an obstacle rather than a person? How many other Richards are running calculations on elimination right now? How many home health workers currently live under surveillance from families who view them as threats to inheritances they've done nothing to earn? Answers don't exist for these questions. Most families considering such actions won't make the mistakes the Mentons made. Most will escape consequences. Denise's last moment of freedom landed at 4:46 p.m. on November 8th. She knelt in front of Harold on a porch while a doorbell camera recorded and killers waited 2 streets away. 52 minutes remained before she walked out that door. If she'd known what was coming, would anything have changed? Would she have run, called police, or stayed on that porch with Harold knowing those 27 seconds were all they had left? No one will ever know. But this much is certain: she held his hand for 3 years, and she deserved to hold it for 3 more. For anyone working in healthcare, vary your routines. Park in different spots, leave at different times. Never assume family members are safe simply because they share blood with your patient. Document every hostile interaction. Document every accusation. Document every threat. Trust what your instincts tell you. Feeling watched, threatened, or unsafe demands immediate reporting. Build that paper trail. Denise had those feelings and chose to ignore them. That choice cost her everything.